Bon, alors bonsoir tout le monde, mesdames et messieurs, et bienvenue à notre quatrième et dernière partie de notre série d'entretiens du printemps 2026. Pour ceux d'entre vous qui nous rejoignent pour la première fois, notre série d'entretiens s'intitule « Célébrer les 80 ans de l'Institut Thomas More, dialogue et rencontre entre nous en face aux enjeux de notre époque ». La rencontre de ce soir s'intitule « Célébrons 80 ans de rencontre grâce à la méthode de discussion Thomas More », which is a very unique method. I would like to acknowledge before we get going any further that we are meeting in Montreal on the island known as Jojake, the traditional territory of the Ganyagahaga, I think I got it, Ganyagahaga Mohawk people. This island has long been a gathering place for many nations. In many indigenous traditions, the land itself holds memory, language, and knowledge. Acknowledging this place is therefore more than naming a territory. It is recognizing that the land beneath us carries stories and responsibilities. May that awareness guide us now as we gather and learn together this evening. Just a brief bit on Thomas More. I know I'm preaching to the choir here. Founded in 1945, the Thomas More Institute is a secular, non-profit academic institution and a pioneer in adult education across Quebec. Celebrating 80 years of leadership in 2025-26, the Institute provides a unique space, a very unique space, I might add, that combines the intellectual rigor of a university with the accessibility and warmth of a community organization. Our mission is to create an environment where adults of all ages gather together to think deeply, question freely, and build community through shared curiosity-driven learning. Our distinctive pedagogical model emphasizes conversation-based learning over traditional lectures, nurturing both critical thinking and a strong sense of belonging. This evening, we're going to do things a little bit differently than the previous three. We're going to divide it into two parts, with the first half consisting of a discussion of the reading for tonight, excerpts from Agnes Callard's book, Open Socrates, The Case for a Philosophical Life, with the audience. The second half will be an interview of the discussion leaders about their experience of leading a discussion using the Thomas More discussion method. Questions from the audience will follow, and after which we will move next door over a little bit of wine till about 8:30. Photos will be taken this evening, so we can post them on our social media. So if you prefer not to be in them, the sides are where you want to be. Let me introduce you now to the three discussion leaders for the first part of the evening, followed by, I will also introduce our other two interviewers. So tonight, to my left, we have Valerie Amyot, or Amyot. Which way do you pronounce it?
Either is fine.
Well,
but Amyot.
Amyot, okay. Valerie Amyot. Valerie is an ICF certified coach who specializes in French language confidence coaching. She helps English-speaking Quebecers feel empowered to speak French with more confidence and self-trust by practicing mindset shifts and helping them challenge limiting beliefs, etc. Aside from coaching, Valerie is an experienced advisor, teacher, tutor, and evaluator with 10 years of academic support experience in schools, businesses, and community organizations. At the Thomas More Institute, Valerie is a course leader who enjoys leading literature classes and getting to know participants through deep and meaningful conversations. She is also a polyglot and is looking forward to designing courses at the Institute that explore the relationship between language and identity through literature. Claire English holds a BA in Classical Civilization. Claire is immediately here on my left, for those of you that haven't met her, and an MA in Judaic Studies, both from Concordia University. She is currently writing her dissertation at Concordia on a history of the Jewish deaf communities of New York in the late 19th to early 20th century. Since 2018, Claire has served as a member of the Thomas More Institute's Curriculum Committee, and she is also a course designer and discussion leader at the Institute. Bless you. Her annual course on poetry, co-led with Imogen Bryant, is a perennial favorite here. Joseph Vietri, the young gentleman to my far left with the fine head of hair and a beard that would make Jeremiah Johnson blush, began as a volunteer at Thomas More in 2015 while working on his PhD. He is now the manager of academic affairs as well as a designer and leader of the courses, generally focusing on medieval thought and the transmission of classical mythology. He has published on medieval interpretations of Orpheus and completed his thesis on the history of love in Western thought, with particular emphasis on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, our next two interviewers, who will take part in the second part, but I thought we'd get them all done tonight. Right in front of me, Irene Menear. And Irene has been in a very integral part of Thomas More for most of Irene's adult life. She began as a degree student and continued to be a volunteer ever since graduating. Irene is grateful to have known the founders of the Institute and to have experienced their mentorship. Participating in classes as both a discussion leader and a course designer has strengthened that bond. She is pleased to have served as a board member and a member of the staff of the curriculum, as curriculum coordinator and seniors outreach program coordinator. She saw these positions as ways to give back to Thomas More. We're forever grateful. And finally, Daniel Schouela. The Thomas More Institute has been a critical part of Danny's life since 1989, when he took his first discussion course on the topic of Freud and women. Danny, wow. That's a tough one, Dan. Danny has been on the Institute's board since 1994, has served as Director of Studies and the Chair of the Curriculum Committee, and has been a member of that committee since 2001. Danny led for the first time in 1992 alongside his mentor, Charlotte Tansey, and designed his first course in 1993. Over the last 3+ decades, Danny has designed nearly 40 courses, principally on psychoanalytic and philosophical aspects of self-transformation. Light stuff, as you can tell. Danny was hooked after taking his seat around the table for the first time in 1989, and he quickly came to regard the Institute as his intellectual home, one in which he has felt inspired to persevere with fellow learners in the ongoing project of making curiosity the center of one's life. So there you have it. These are the people that are going to make it all happen tonight, and please enjoy.
Thank you.
Well, welcome. So in true Thomas More fashion, we're going to jump in right with the text. So if we could turn to page 27. And we'd love to have a reader on the paragraph starting with, I believe that Tolstoy. Any volunteers? Before I pick on someone. Also in true Thomas More fashion. Who is it? Oh, good, great, thank you. Just that paragraph.
Just a minute coming up.
No problem. Excuse my voice as well. Okay.
27, right?
Yeah, 27, I believe.
You believe?
I do.
I'll take your word for it.
All right.
Okay, which paragraph? I believe.
Yeah.
Okay. I believe that Tolstoy identified a special class of question that I am going to call untimely question. I like that. An untimely question is a question that comes at the wrong time. namely after it has been answered. Untimely questions are remarkable not only because they are hard to answer, but first and foremost, because they are hard to ask. And they are hard to ask not only because it is hard to pose them to others, but first and foremost, because it is hard to pose them to oneself. We are familiar with the circumstances under which a person will be unable to get others to engage with her question when they won't let her talk, or when her interlocutor doesn't want to admit he doesn't know the answer, or when there is simply no one around. But can't one always pose a question to oneself? No. Some questions are so elusive that if you write them down on a piece of paper and then go on to read what you have written out loud to yourself over and over again to the point where even after you stop talking, the words of the question are echoing through your head, you still won't be asking the question. You'll be going through the motions of inquiry without actually inquiring into anything.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm glad you like this, and we were very intrigued by this concept, which I think is very central to our discussion and going forward into our sort of thinking about Thomas More and the method. So we wanted to start by kind of unpacking this and asking you, how did you understand untimely questions, and what makes a question untimely? Yes.
As she tells us that what makes it untimely is it arrives when it's already been answered. Yeah. And I take it that from having read it, that the implication is that you have the impression that you're living with a certain functional answer to a question and it's working. And so then when the question arises, that's untimely because it challenges you to unearth some assumptions that now you may have to falsify. It's untimely, it's uncomfortable. It's untimely because it comes not before it was answered, but after it was answered.
And in what sense has the question already been posed? When did you have the sense she meant unconsciously, somewhere long ago? I mean, in what sense, if it's been answered?
I think it's a matter of looking at yourself and not ready to do that.
But if these answers are forming and shaping so much of how we actually are going about our life, if we're living with these answers, then what is it that makes it so reluctant to even get at surfacing these questions?
Well, I think it's because it makes us really uncomfortable. I think our unconscious questions are kind of presuppositions. And so when it's raised, it kind of makes us begin to wonder if what we've always thought is true or have presupposed is in fact not so. And that's very uncomfortable, I would say.
Yeah, Karen.
Yeah, I would go read just beyond what Paul read, which says the reason why you can't ask yourself untimely questions is that you think you already have the answer to them. And the reason you think you have the answer is that you are using the answer.
That's right.
And you may not have really ever posed the question as a question to yourself, but you just always thought, well, I am courageous when I do X, Y, and Z, and that's what I do. And so I am courageous, and I don't need to ask that question.
Yeah, in a way, it could also be because the answers have been given to you from childhood onwards. That education is society as such has shaped you, has provided you with answers before you were asked the questions, or maybe you were not allowed to ask the question. So that goes back to the master curiosity. If you keep curiosity eventually, you don't have those set answers.
And it goes back to the unpopularity of Socrates himself. Yes.
I want to say something kind of in line with that, where I think there are societally expected answers to the questions. like, oh, what's the point of life? Well, be a good person or be kind. But then what does that look like? That can get really uncomfortable and we don't want to actually deal with that. And so we just kind of live out of our unconscious, like subconscious understanding of what that means, but we don't want to talk about it because there could be judgment or different opinions.
I mean, what would be the stakes of realizing that we had an answer, that there was a question, and whatever answer all along has been incorrect?
It's, when you say that the question, like the answer we had is to discover it's incorrect. And that brings to the point of, I wouldn't know if there weren't other people around. I can only know that I was wrong when I hear something else and go, damn, that's better than what I was thinking, right? And so, and then it makes me question, and even if it's embarrassing, go, oh my God, a lifetime I thought this way. So the way I would know is by knowing that I had the wrong idea, is in discourse with others.
Because she had this idea that we can't ask ourselves untimely questions. Yeah, Maria.
There was a very powerful idea here in terms of thinking, not being something that you do by yourself, but you do it in community.
Yeah.
And I think it's what Giovanna is pointing out to, this idea that these questions come, I mean, they are made to be considered in a space where we could feel free to ask those questions and play with, what the different perspectives are.
One of the descriptions that we get of Socrates is that he's both a gadfly and a midwife.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel we're sort of talking about that. We can't begin from internal because we don't have that dialogue with the other, that encounter with the other. So maybe I'd like us to explore those two roles, gadfly and midwife. And then we can look at a particular text. At the bottom of page 150, the last two lines, and we would want to read into 151.
150?
150, yes.
I could read it.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
And it starts with the other Socrates?
No.
No,
So,
in these,
so what is?
so what is
Yeah.
Socrates? 2 seconds. Let's put in my glasses. So what is Socrates? Is he the gadfly who leaves people stunned, bereft, lost, and confused? Or the midwife who helps birth their beautifully clear idea babies? Is he engaged in a fundamentally negative reputational activity of clearing away pretensions to knowledge, or in a fundamentally positive, inquisitive one of finding new items that one can add to what one claims to know? I call this the gadfly midwife paradox.
And so in what way can we say that discussion or exploring ideas with others acts as both a gadfly but also a midwife? Why is the author sort of highlighting this particular idea of Socrates?
Well, because it shows that Socrates or somebody else needs to ask the questions deeper and deeper so that you realize that your answer is not such a good one. The flaws in it are pointed out. And then as a midwife helps you to reconstruct some other vision or some other answer to the question that you didn't have before to give birth to that.
Judy.
And after what Susan said, I would just add that what the author points out is that the two act seamlessly together. So while the refutation is going on, so is the bringing forth the question that helps provide the answer. So it was quite interesting. I like the author because she sort of leads us through different possibilities. First of all, she says, well, it's refutation and then the quest for the right answer. But then she says, no, it's not two separate processes. It's one process together.
That's right. Well, I was gonna say something similar to what Judy said. And this idea that in order to truly learn something, we have to unlearn too. So it's this whole dynamic between learning and unlearning, questioning assumptions, and then therefore, you know, you can be in another space. And that Judy, I agree 100%. They're so interrelated. You know, it's not like you unlearn and then you learn. They're constantly happening, you know, in a cycle. You can see some examples in philosophy too. In Indian philosophy, for instance, you know, Shiva is destruction, but he's also the god of rebirth. So something has to be destroyed in order to rebirth.
People tell us about the mind of the person in dialogue. If refutation or the ability to be comfortable with someone saying the position you're taking is wrong, dialogue.
On the same page of 151, the gadfly midwife paradox, it could be called the paradox of Socrates' humility. Socrates was famous his contemporaries for the fact that he repeatedly knew he knew nothing, or how his own ignorance is sometimes called Socratic humility. I mean, it's a clear answer, and I agree with it 1,000%. I'm Socrates Jr. Don't forget this. He shows you how he's against all the other things, memory and stuff.
Joseph, could you rephrase your specific question about refutation?
Yes.
I want to hear it.
Yeah, so what does it mean about the individual learner if refutation has to be something we are comfortable with and willing to undergo that process, right? There's a bit of vulnerability there as well, that we have to come through the process knowing that we might be wrong about something. But what does that tell us then as learners? What are the implications for the whole learning process, if that is at the core what Callard is sort of presenting?
Well, I think there has to be some kind of a trusting, it has to be within a trusting relationship. You know, it just doesn't happen bing bang conversation. It's an ongoing give and take.
That's why the image of the gadfly is a little, I don't know if it's appropriate or not, because we're not going to open ourselves to question our ideas. If someone is a gadfly bugging us about how our ideas are wrong in a harsh way.
I was listening to an interview with her today, and so she was mentioning, the word kept coming up is, so the gadfly, of course, you're coming in because you know there's going to be a gadfly to refugee, okay? So you're coming in knowing that's going to happen. But then there's an understanding that this is a safe space for this to happen. And once we've all agreed this is a safe space, there's no attack going on here. So you kind of like took that agreement and you said, yeah, I'm into play. And you walk in and you take a seat because you're ready for that. And there was also another part where I talked about why would you do this to yourself, right? And then further in this interview, which I'm not sure if you can hear, is the love. So there's love in different ways, but the love of learning, right? And that you can get like a rush when all of a sudden you're letting go of a thought because a new one's coming in. And I've experienced that in this school. It's like all of a sudden you're going, oh, and you get all excited, like your body's like the emotion. She talks about the body and the emotionality of it. When you get just so turned on that, wow. And so that is what I'm ready to put up with. I'm ready to put up with, oh man, I didn't know I was that dumb, let's say, because there might be the opportunity of something new starting.
Could I reply to Susan about the gadfly? I think you have to be very judicious about how you use it. And what's amusing, I was thinking back over 40 years of leaders training where we use the Plato's cave, which I adore, everybody adores. We are living in the dark and we need the light. But the apology, and Carol's laughing, and I'm sure you'll agree, it's a tough one to ask questions on because it's very annoying. And Socrates seems to be very annoying, and he doesn't like poetry for, but I love this paper, and I've never wanted to listen to any more of the Platonic dialogues because the apology is so frustrating and annoying. But the way it's presented is you're getting a whole host of other characters, just like a discussion group where everyone has their own opinion. So an occasional gadfly, as long as you can slap them down, has purpose. But I don't think we genuinely tried to shock people because shocking doesn't always work.
Sometimes the question has a journey to me. So it probably goes to the internet at the first, but it cannot only be answered by the internet. So it has to take a journey down to the heart, because the heart has its own intelligence, and therefore it cannot respond spontaneously to a head question, because it has to simmer a bit and have a pause in between, and then you answer it from the heart, which totally changes the tone of it in responding, because the intellect has very quickly the left brain, but the heart is a bit slow and more cogitation happens from the heart. So that's why it surprises the person who attempts to answer it, but doesn't know what will be coming out of the response.
Yeah, what's interesting is that his methodology, you see that he was only interested in the dialogue. So it's one-on-one, which is, so the question to the group, it's a little bit of Thomas methodology.
Yeah.
So it's really stuck in and I find it quite rigid. And in some of that, we're talking about something 2,500 years ago, and we're just learning it from other people talking how he was doing it. But I would challenge that particular approach. And it's almost like the Freudian approach. Okay, I'm going to have one-on-one and it's psychoanalytic, but it's not. Maybe it does not reflect the way we are learning and developing and being challenged by other people around us.
Saw Judy or Mariella.
Yes, I find your point interesting. I was thinking the same thing myself. But back to your question, Joseph, more directly. I think for the person who's being refuted, she has to feel that the person doing the refutation is treating him or her with respect. And seeing him as another who has not the same truth or the same view as the two. They don't share the same view, but yet they respect the other, and they feel that the person being refuted has to feel that he is being treated as somebody who also is searching for the truth. That point was made in the last section. You'll probably get more to it, because that was a really good section.
I was just trying to figure out, this whole vision of that one. And how does it apply to the way we lead courses or the way we experience courses? And I have a hard time picturing, a real refutation type of thing. And I think, I don't know, like the way I can think about it is that I express a position and somebody else expressed something that I never thought about. So therefore, that's a questioning of my position, and that's the dynamic, rather than, I think that this idea that I'm going to be questioning you, I'm going to give birth to your ideas. It's a more dynamic, and it comes from having people with so many different backgrounds expressing ideas that, oh, I never thought about that, or something that bother you? And then you said to say, what did bother me? You know, like, and so it's a whole dynamic. So the gadfly for me is more the mixture of perspectives, but it is an introspective process, like you said, and it has to also, it's very interesting that, you know, the convergence here, it has to imply that I'm willing to examine myself, I'm willing to absorb it, and it's emotional, it's part of the, you know, who I am in a way.
And so the midwife aspect of the gadfly midwife has a special role. I see a lot of comments on this. Okay, so we'll go with Susan. And then-
Yeah, I want to raise something. I've always questioned whether Thomas More really follows the Socratic method in the classes. Because I'm glad you said what you said, because I don't think we really use that Socratic approach of having someone who goes deeper and deeper into what's wrong with your answer, farther and farther. We get what we get more from not someone sort of attacking your ideas deeper and deeper, but from people saying things we hadn't thought of before.
Joanna, you want to respond to that particular?
You know, in a way, it's the part of asking further and further. I find that when I entered this school after about a year of getting to see what was going on, when somebody spoke, so we all read the same material, if somebody were to say, I think, and then there was a question asked, like a refute, well, since we read the material, if you said, well, what brought you to say that, I have something to stand on, right? And so that part of, so this is what I stand on, then come back at me now, right? Because, but not like aggressive, it's just, so I said that because, and then if you come back again, so then now the game's on, right? So that's, does that make sense?
Heather, go ahead.
Thank you for your question, Bernard. Thomas More is better than Socrates. Because he had one-to-one dialogues, but the paper actually talks about introducing new people on 204. And that's what we do. Everyone brings their experience and expertise. And I see the dialogues, if you had every one of these crazy characters, if they were in a room together, you would have a fabulous conversation. But the dialogues are just one-on-one.
Yeah, the kind of the episode that was mentioned is that the unusual course, that there's nobody within Thomas More is trying to be naive, so they should be challenging.
Yes.
And I don't know, and I also that we put on the agenda truly existential questions where people will have to discuss about. What is virtue?
I just
What is
wanted to
virtue?
say that Bernard Lonergan, his examination of bias is very helpful because that's helping getting through your own mistakes and preconceptions. And very often if another student does that, that's even more wonderful, rather than a confrontation or something that's aggressive or arrogant.
One of the things that Callard does in the article is give us this really interesting sort of definition or idea about what thinking is in the first place. And she sort of says, well, you know, usually we think of thinking as being this private internal activity. As I'm listening to you, and you know, if so, you know, we're having sort of, you know, the idea that, well, maybe it's not very Socratic, and you know, that are we challenging each other? How are we, do you think, thinking about thinking? Are we still thinking about thinking as a private activity that is then brought to the table, and we enter a conversation as these private thinkers, right? And how does what she suggests about how we should think about thinking, how is that different, or how would it be different? How could it be different? And I don't know if you wanted
That's
to
okay,
read,
yeah.
read something on that.
One principle, I mean, which is critical and I think present the spirit of what the dispute is that as really the fact when you come prepared to say that you don't know, it's like we're starting from the baseline journey of very little knowledge or no knowledge. If you start and if you engage with this and you don't come as the expert, but as someone that is prepared to learn, that's critical. So this is Socrates, that reflects very much in philosophy. I think that's strong.
Let's ground the question in page 174. So the top two short paragraphs, would somebody be willing to read those two paragraphs? Starting with the misunderstanding.
Here, the misunderstanding endures. Wait, is everybody
Wait, I
there?
think everybody's struggling to get their place.
174. First full paragraph that begins the misunderstanding endures. Everybody there? Great. The misunderstanding endures to this day, even among philosophers. We are inclined to retreat from conversation to a shelter we call thinking. When someone has a good rebuttal, we sometimes say, I'll have to think more about this, as though the real test comes when I import the claim into my inner sanctum, the place where thinking happens. We breathe a sigh of relief when some dispute comes to an end and we can, as we say, sit back and think. Arguing is stressful. Thinking, we tell ourselves, is enjoyable. Socrates would say, that's because you're not actually thinking. The demand to choose between the pursuit of truth and the avoidance of error comes as an insult to a person who was taking for granted that they had been doing both. Socrates tells us that our minds are not as powerful as we thought they were. When we shelter from the demands and pressures of the outside world and quietly engage in an activity we call thinking to ourselves, that is not, in fact, when thinking happens. Thinking happens during the uncomfortable times when you permit others to intrude into your private mental world to correct you.
It's interesting in these two paragraphs, Callard talks about this private thinking, if we could call it that, as retreating, as going into a shelter. So she seems to have certain opinions about this. But what are we doing then if thinking is a social process, as she later says on 175? What is it that we're doing when we're on our own engaging with the text?
I just want to go back to what Tony said about having to let ideas sort of percolate down. And sometimes you hear something and it sort of maybe it jars you or surprises you, but it takes a little while to kind of get it. And so I call that thinking about it, that maybe it's just kind of processing it. And so that this conversation, not all of us are that quick, you know. I'm sure not like Socrates able to kind of get in there with the next idea. So that the conversation happens over a much longer time frame than the 2-hour discussion. Yeah, often. So I guess it is being open to new ideas, but I don't quite side with her totally with what she's saying here.
Yes, so on that part where we're saying thinking happens during that last sentence, thinking happens during uncomfortable times when you permit others to intrude into your private mental world to correct you. When I heard that, I went, oh yeah, but first I got to take what's new. What was the ding that all of a sudden went, oh, aha. Now I got to go home and just be quiet. And sometimes I'm just going to watch Downton Abbey because while I'm watching it for the 15th time, I can go someplace in the back and let some processing, I think was the word I heard, processing happen, and things fall into place differently than they ever have before because something shifted. And then comes to have a trustworthy person to say, can I tell you how crazy my thinking is right now? Because everything's changed. And then to have somebody that's, you know, because this is going to be an uncomfortable conversation, because you're going to say, well, to be brave enough to say, this is how it shifted. If, you know, if it's something, anyways, that's what I'm thinking.
I was wondering if she's differentiating between thinking and reflecting. And because if I understand correctly what she's saying about thinking, it seems to me thinking is what kind of upsets me. Like, and so I've had experiences in my life when I've been in class or in a conversation where I really had this insight into something that became really upsetting to me. And that's only happened to me in a conversation with others, you know, or in a conversation, so-called conversation with a piece of art or something like that, that's really kind of ruptured something in me. So I'm just wondering if that's the way that thinking is being understood here, and what we have often called thinking is more reflecting, you know, with this kind of thing that I do when I'm just by myself kind of thing.
Okay, from what I understand, is the real thinking comes from no answers from Socrates. Questions make you think. It's this, it's that, and, you know, until you understand what it's all about.
That's Irene's hand.
I would say I actually agree with you, Christine, that she seems to be making a distinction between thinking and what I would name as reflecting. I too would name that reflecting. But I nevertheless, so I think that's a useful distinction, except that I would still subsume reflecting under the heading of thinking for my own self. And I think she has as her jumping off point for this whole discussion. When someone has a good rebuttal, we sometimes say, I'll have to think more about this, as though the real test comes when I import the claim into my inner sanctum. She uses that as her jumping off point. And it seems to me that right there, she's embracing a fallacy, and we don't need that fallacy. The fact that sometimes we do rationalize in reaction to somebody's really persuasive rebuttal of what we've been saying, and we say, oh, I need time to think about that because we want to save face. We don't want to right away admit that it's challenging us. Well, yeah, that's true, and she's perceived that that's the case. But I think like 90% of the time when people say, I need to think about that, it really is because they need to process it. They need to reflect on it, make it their own, and that is under the heading of thinking also. So I feel she gets dogmatic and a little bit superior when she suggests that we never really do thinking in our own private inner. So we don't need that dogma, and we don't need the like smearing at people who rationalize. Yes, it's human to rationalize, but we also do this other thing that has intellectual integrity.
I would like to use the metaphor of the tree and its branches. The tree has a trunk with all these different branches. They're all related to the tree, but you cannot get the full answer from any one branch. So you're still connected with the main thoughts, but each one has a responsibility. Some of the branches are further out, but yet they're all entangled in the trunk of the tree. But you can't say one branch is the tree, it's part of the tree. So every response to whatever the question has relationship to the main question, which is the trunk of the tree.
So, sorry, the one thing what I'm struggling with the Socrates approach and the community is that it seems that it's limited. If you have a complex question to address and you generally engage with him, whether plays his role, the only feedback you're going to have is a correction. As opposed to, you potentially could have a good idea. Your thoughts are maybe not yet totally the midwife issue. And there is never this thing, okay, well, let's build on your idea. Let's go beyond. And that doesn't seem to be there, which is incredible, because most of the value of interacting is not to have someone tell you, no, you're wrong, you just go right here to go left. It's just say, okay, well, no, you're doing something. Let's discuss about it. And it doesn't seem to, it seems to be very, but I was not understanding, it seems to be very rigid as a method. And it's based on someone of a super intellect that maybe was able within that method. But most of us, we're not so guys. We're not very able to do that. If my primary objective is try to correct what you're saying, I'm shutting it down. And it goes back to the fellow parents and child.
But so I think we're all talking about from the point of view of the teacher, we forget to talk about the student. And I think in the one-on-one contact with in the Socratic kind of situation, the dialogue, perhaps Socrates becomes the napping or whatever you call it.
Gadfly.
Gadfly. Because who the student is with him, right? Not because he wants to be like that, but because he thinks this is the appropriate way in this particular situation because of that person needs this. So I think there's a very important part here to, so, and then, the midwife, the person is on her way, on his way to put together their thoughts. So you help that person, but sometimes you need to be bitten a little bit. I think he will use one or the other, depending on the student or the other person.
That's another way that Thomas More is superior. For many years, we had a quote from Plato the Meno that it is the discussion leader who asks a question neutrally, doesn't attack or let you know what their opinion is. And there's tremendous power in that. So it's the leaders who direct the conversation and they all play different roles. And you all have to read the Thomas More Bible. There's Mao's red book, there's Jung's red book, and there's this one, and we've got lots of copies for all of you. And our ancestors are speaking to us. They knew what they were doing. And the three leaders is primordial. They all have different roles. So one can be gadfly, one can do this, one can do the other. And the other is every third week you're a student, so you can say anything outrageous you want.
We are running a little quick on time though, so I want to come
One more
back to
thing,
the.
Charlotte introduced literature. She will appeal
Right.
to the imagination and the heart. So a million reasons why Thomas More is unique and wonderful.
I would like to play the role of the gadfly a little bit. Because is Callard saying that the position that Socrates has is one of entrenched rejection of everything? Or is she speaking about something a bit more nuanced? Let's go to page 203. Who will want to read the paragraph, the solution is to recognize?
The solution is to recognize that it is possible to direct a question such as, what is X, at someone else, even if you have your own answer to that question, and even if you do not suspend judgment with reference to that answer. When Socrates asks, what is X, and his interlocutor offers an answer, Socrates doesn't reply with a simple, great, thanks so much. Instead, he asks a series of pointed questions, each of which leads to an explanation of why he cannot accept the answer. What is the soil from which his probing questions spring? Socrates' own conception of X, refined over the course of many such conversations.
Perfect. I'm going to read one line from the next page, 204. At the beginning of that second paragraph, the first full paragraph, Socrates is testing what he has learned from others against what he stands to learn from each new person. So what does it tell us about the questions and the kind of probing that Socrates is doing? Is he doing it because he has a position that he's forever going to be entrenched in? Or is there something else that's happening here?
Yeah, there's a part here, and that's the last sentence here on the 203, is that he says, instead he asks a series of pointed questions, each of which leads to an explanation of why he cannot accept the answer. The thing is that he gives an explanation of why.
Mhm.
So as he progresses from week to week or whatever of speaking, so the level of what he stands on to refute, that's the thing. It's not just saying like, yeah, no, I don't think you're, say it another way, or I don't agree. Well, that's empty. The thing here is he always comes with the why and then that gives you, like the tennis ball comes back. He told you why he doesn't agree, and then everything expands from there.
You have to have,
Go ahead, sorry.
it's like a bottomless question. But I mean, what is that question?
I wonder if we can, for the sake of time, compress a little bit. And, one of the things he does sort of later is talk about Socratizing and anti-Socratizing. And this maybe, sort of gets at what is Socrates aiming at? So could we jump to 248? Very quickly, just what's 248? Maybe very quickly, just zip through that paragraph that starts Socrates unified domains. Yeah.
Socrates unified domains as distinct as love, death, and politics, not by analyzing them in terms of some underlying common denominator, but rather by seeing them as converging upward toward a single aspiration, inquiry into untimely questions. Instead of arguing that these domains all have a common source or cause or are built up out of common materials, Socrates argues that what they have in common is a goal. To frame the point in Aristotelian terminology, anti-Socratizing unifies by way of a common material cause, whereas Socratizing unifies by way of a common final cause. The Socratizing move seeks out the coherent reality behind the incoherent imitation of the reality that shows up in our everyday lives. And it often reveals that what was going on in everyday life was something very different from what it had appeared to be. For example, war is really a form of conversation.
So, rather than sort of destruction, for example, tearing down constantly, could we kind of reframe it as, well, not different from sort of just destruction in a very quite a sort of negative sense? Could we think of it as Socrates has a project of kind of like clearing the brush, of weeding, of pruning? And also, how you ponder, does Socrates have an ideal of reality? Is there a coherent, is Socrates' notion of reality idealized? If his project is aiming at the coherent reality behind the incoherent imitations of the reality, right? I mean, that's sort of Aristotelian, right? Is there a coherent reality behind the incoherent? Is that an imitation, or is that just what we're kind of what we are actually in the midst of?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
It's a loaded question.
We're almost finished, so I gotta maybe come back next week.
I thought that Socrates didn't say anything but know thyself, and was always up to Plato to concoct.
This is
So
where-
you're using Plato?
Well, I'm
this is
using
where I want
Callard,
to come in
so
also.
yeah.
Because we know that
right, yeah.
Socrates is written by Plato. And in the beginning of the article, she discussed that some of the scholars think that the later parts are more the ideas of Plato. And this sounds to me much more like Plato's idea of some ideal form behind things.
I was just thinking about, the very fact that we ask questions, this is kind of long again, but the very fact we ask questions is that we anticipate that there's an answer, that there is an answer in the universe to the questions we ask.
Yes.
And I think that Socrates had real questions, but he also had this capacity to see that the answers that the kind of glib answers that we often offer to questions You know, he sees through them because he's really seeking the answer.
Oh, the ideal, that's what you were saying.
Okay,
Sorry.
Mariella,
Okay.
because she's been trying to get.
Yeah,
it
no,
right.
no, I'm sorry, I was just repeating her word, ideal reality.
I think that that's a key point, Christine. I've been trying to, there is a way of questioning that where I question, but I have the idea of what the right answer is. So my questions lead to that answer, to that reality. But there is another type of questioning that I think is something that I find very interesting, when I question to learn myself. So, if, you know, I question but with an open mind, in the sense of, it's a real questioning. And I find sometimes as a leader, it's very hard for me to get to that point because I already have my own assumptions about, you know, and then so I ask a question and I constantly try to keep myself thinking, this isn't a real question. So it's this idea that the questioning, and I think that's what makes it so special, is that it's a real sharing choir. So we're trying to learn from each other. We're trying to, and that is very important. And for me, it's the ideal method. And
And at the bottom of page 224, after Nino's paragraph, if you and I both have the same questions, get different answers, a path opens up. That to me is open Socrates, opening the door. We can test our answers against each other. This process is Socratic inquiry. The Socratic method is a way you can make progress without knowing in advance how are going to do so. That's my answer to this.
All right, I think we can get one more in.
One more question.
Bernard.
No, I think I like the last one. No, I was saying that as we made, it's a comment and that goes beyond the people, and it's the sort of Western way of thinking about answering complex issues and the absence of spirituality, if you like, in these cases. We are attaching so much importance to words. It's all about words and finding solutions expressed verbally. I don't think it's realistic. There are some issues that best looked at through spirituality. That's what I found.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, thank you for bringing that up because we wondered about that, for example, in the whole model of conversation and the role of listening and speaking. She was sort of saying nobody wants to be the listener, and I said, well, that's quite cultural in its way, isn't it? And listening can be a very honored position. So thank you.
Now we'll maybe shift gears here and ask Irene and Danny to interview the interviewers.
She's credit for every interview.
It's amazing how much ground we were able to cover in a relatively short period. I was just saying, it's amazing to me how much ground we were able to cover in a relatively short period of time in connection with a text that is complex and dense. So I commend you guys for having succeeded in getting us into the text. So what I kept on wondering about as I heard the various comments about refutation in particular, I wanted to ask each of you about whether or not, as you read this text, whether or not it spoke to your experience as discussion leaders at Thomas More. And I have in mind two different angles on that. One is sort of a micro level, and one is sort of a macro level. The micro level, what I have in mind is the business of the back and forth of refutation, and whether or not that has to be understood in a quasi-aggressive, confrontational way, right? The second angle is the more macro level, which we touched upon when we alluded to the notion of equality and respect, right? Because she's got some very interesting statements at the very end of that last section. And I'll just read them. And you can use them as these statements as a springboard for commenting on whether her text speaks to your experience at Thomas More, both in class and over the years of your involvement here, right? So she writes, conversation is where we find our true home. This amounts to the Socratization of the whole of life. And then she goes on 50 pages later, using the same metaphor of home, right?
What page is it, Danny?
So 249 and then 294. So on 249, you find the sentence, conversation is where we find our true home. This amounts to the Socratization of the whole of life, right? And on 294, the proper home of equality and respect is not the outside, but the inside, the world of the conversation. So we've got refutation and finding our true home, where we get to finally discover and practice equality.
It's a really good question. I think, yes, so she struck a lot of chords for me. I would say it's from the opposite end, in that oftentimes when I design or lead a course, it's on a text that I've sort of lived with for a while, whether during the design process or I've studied it in the past. And I think I'm the one who comes to test or have myself refuted in a way. I'm coming and I'm bringing I'm hoping and wanting the dialogue to sort of help me engage into the text with a bit more depth, from angles I never thought of. And that's sort of one of the most enriching things I've gotten here, is having the ability to speak to 15, 20 people weekly on a shared common text that I thought I had grasp on, but every week coming out with something new and something, a completely different angle. And so in that way, I think, yeah, she was definitely hitting.
So it doesn't sound like refutation is something that you personally feel an inclination to shy away from, rather than you sort of invite it, in a certain sense, bring it on.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that I often tell the new leaders as well. You have to be comfortable with not getting to where you want to get to, because unless you're going to force people in or drag them, you got to be okay with that. You got to be okay with other ideas grounded in the text always. Sort of being out there, and you have to be comfortable with yourself to do that, but it takes a little bit of a softer approach when you approach these things.
So the principle for only the attended two courses, but they will be leading refutation, because the readers are not coming with a point of view. They're opening up the dialogue on the content of the text. So there's no someone coming and then engaging you with already a point of view. I think that's the. I believe this is the philosophy of those workshops.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly. But I mean, as humans, we're automatically going to have entrenched positions. I think it's natural. And so the thing is, when you come up as a human with a particular view or saying that this text says that, and now you're confronted by someone who says, well, I don't think that, or I don't see it that way. There has to be a level of sort of, I want to use the word humility, but in a positive way, humility in being able to be receptive to that new position and being able to consider it and sort of envelop it into your larger framework.
My experience with this is that in one occasion, but if you have someone that is coming with a point of view, then you have good thinking. You may bias the discussion already. Almost like in the classroom, the teacher is saying that, so you're potentially impacting the ability of the group to reflect. Space, if you like.
And I think this points to the point about equality as well, is that with the Thomas More method, there isn't an implied hierarchy that we see in a traditional classroom where the leader is imparting knowledge. It's really that we're all co-creators of knowledge and we're constructing that knowledge. So it's really, yeah, like you were saying just about, even if you have this point of view, especially if you've designed the course, it's letting go of this and just being in service of where the conversation goes and not trying to push a point. So for me, that's really about the equality part of the question, is that everyone has their own unique voice and has something that will enrich the conversation.
Yeah, I think I might try to sort of work backwards a little bit. You know, this idea of the conversation as whole within the conversation, it touches on something that came up in our talk amongst ourselves, which is, well, what quite is the relationship between this particular conversation and the broader kind of social field? Because that does seem to happen in a time and place, for example, because we've got a lot of other activities. And there was this, I think, for me, a murkiness a little bit between how quite they were related. And I think one way of getting it is, there was something about the sort of relationship of theory and practice. That, you know, but where does, since these, you know, the untimely question has so much to do with the practices of living our life, and it did seem like thinking for Socrates was a practice and conversing, but so there seemed to be this underlying sort of, you know, if we're finding our home in conversation, is that a practice of living together, and how does that fit within broader practices of living together? Maybe I'm going too far afield. So let me try to connect this with your second part. So she's sort of talking about equality in conversation. Well, she hangs that on this idea of two people at a cocktail party, who she, you know, just sort of conveys as being joined together in a kind of participating in a shared quest for shared superiority. And there was a kind of equality, and that, but she's picturing these two people who really, in a matter of speaking, aren't jerks, right? Who really aren't, who are stepping back from trying to one-up each other and are willing the other one forward. And there's something very cultural about that. It's assumed, so she is here kind of assuming a particular kind of cultural practice that's already established more broadly outside the inside of this conversation, right? Or I mean, maybe you want to invite us to think about that space, the home of conversation, as being more proliferating more than just perhaps what we would want to think of the Thomas More table. That's something. So, and in terms of refutation, I think that sort of also, you know, makes me think about cultural practices. And it was really interesting leading around a table where Moira Carley had been the designer in our inquiry course and was a participant, and a great Moira Carley participant. So she would sometimes ask questions, and she had this way of raising challenges to other people's thinking that I don't have. And I really do think that it comes out of her experience in a particular time and place. And that there's a broader extent to which we're less willing to challenge another person's thinking, slightly on the fact that, well, everybody's got their opinion, and you know, and we want to certainly push, you know, on that, but we have it that we bring to the table, and it can be hard to break. And also because of the broader context that, well, am I going to be understood to be being kind of a jerk if I challenge that thinking? Because that might not be familiar for them. And so when I try to just sort of move ahead in that way, they're immediately going to think, oh my gosh, we're in a knocking heads. So which leads me to the question, well, how can we, in Thomas More, make this a space that reconstitutes and renews practices of meaningful refutation and immerses people in that in a way where they don't immediately sink. They can swim until, you know, And how can we move people into that space so that they, as participants, become comfortable with a challenge to their thinking, realize, oh, how productive that is, and become comfortable challenging others, and know, right?
Yeah, it's weird that I'm wondering about the adequacy of the concept of challenge to characterize that kind of exchange that she's trying to describe. Because she wishes so much to characterize it as the practice of equality and respect that I think we need to search for a different kind of vocabulary, so that in relation to your wish to situate this in a cultural context, my hunch was that she was trying to push this into an ethical sphere.
Ethical?
Yeah, so maybe I'm using the wrong word, but so I think what I'm getting at with the word challenge is that will the participants identify that as respect and equality? Or is there something about the broader context that immediately makes them think, oh, it doesn't matter how polite he sounds, I don't know, he's kind of getting at, you know?
Yeah.
I should have the right to, you know, and people are maybe more defensive, more on guard, more a little bit on edge than perhaps in other.
It turns out to be often the case that somebody will show up at TMI for the first time, get hooked, and then come back for more. And so we have to be able to account for that as well.
Only the example is that in a recent class that we had two individuals that came to Thomas More as a couple, and they thanked us very much for the opportunity to come here, and it was so gratifying. But I was sort of interested in the questions that you posed and the pages that you chose. And a question that I have is something that I've also experienced, and was on one of the pages. He's afforded the experience of watching his own thinking fall short. And that was an interesting question for me, because I wondered, and not only in the sense of falling short, is that how do you pose the question that comes after the falling short? Like, what is the next step? And I think this is when we have, when we're all together in course training, I think that question has often come, but the first question, and it just doesn't go anywhere. And then what do you do then? And I thought it was interesting in regards to how Socrates sort of discussed it, is that he would ask someone, if it posed a question about their parents or different things like that. And then he went into specific questions. And he says, how are such questions even askable? How can Socrates pose questions on which he himself cannot suspend judgment? And I wondered how that, in regards to the questions that you asked, because you asked questions of thinking, of the ultimate questions, the Gadfly and different like that. How do you go beyond that first question to the question that will engage everyone?
I think, yeah, so the first question failing will happen inevitably.
It does.
It will happen inevitably. And so I think the beauty of the method is that we do have that shared text that throughout that week, everyone has sort of studied and digested. And so inevitably what happens, I think in my personal experience, is while maybe your question isn't answered, someone will bring up something that is sort of connected to or runs parallel to the question. And that has a way of sort of resuscitating. And I think it comes back to the idea of like open dialogue, where it's a safe space where people can sort of bring their perspectives. And really key is that shared text. That's one thing I thought Callard was talking about dialogue between individuals, sort of open, but what we have at Thomas More is a third partner in that sort of dance or whatever that we have. It's the text itself which enriches the dialogue discussion, acts as the cornerstone, and sort of acts as the foundation to ensure that it's not just I think or I believe, it's that we can come back to something that we all accept and that we're all ready to engage with. And last thing I would say, the other beauty about Thomas More, something that draws us in, the people who come are coming because they want to. They're not being forced, they're not being told they must, right? They're coming because they love learning, they have a passion for the topic, and so they've done the reading, and so they have the tools to sort of hopefully get us out of those first questions that fall flat.
But it's also, I think, the aspect that I got from Callard is that it is a shared social event. And I think that we sometimes forget when we're in a class together is that it is an event where we are all people together and not as individuals.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, that was one of the blessings that I found from Callard is that it reiterated that point over and over again in that case. And I sometimes think that we forget that, yes, we are individuals and we have our own questions, but we are all together asking questions that we can all share together. And that progresses even further in that respect.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to, when it comes to leading, we always have a roadmap. We have that initial question that we want to ask. And when we say that it falls short, I think it also implies that we do have a certain expectation of where things might go. We're anticipating. And when we see with the response from the audience that is not, from the participants, that's not the case, I think it's, like Joseph mentioned, always anchoring in the text is really helpful, but also following the curiosity of the participants in the class. And so seeing where, even if there's silence, or someone will say, I don't know really how to answer that, but I was wondering about this. And then someone else asks that question, and then we go in that direction. So I think it's the importance of really following the curiosity of where people want to go with the text.
Did you want to come in on
that? You've done your work, right?
I'll come in with another
Okay.
question. So as I read this text, I found it really interesting to couple Callard's phrase, the Socratization of the whole of life, with the red book that Heather was referring to. The title of that book is Curiosity at the Center of One's Life. Now that's, Martin O'Hara's edited volume of the work of Eric O'Connor, right? So I had always thought about curiosity as sort of a static notion, that is to say, oh, okay. But when I read Callard, I began to sort of think of it differently, that it's a process and that it's a practice of a certain kind, and that we should never imagine that we can ever get to the point where curiosity is effectively at the center of our lives, because it's difficult to be curious and to be open-minded. And speaking personally, I've been leading courses for a very long time, and every time round, I feel that it's an extremely difficult task. It's a joyful process, but it's extremely difficult. It makes me very anxious. And so I was wondering, do you guys have a sense about whether those two phrases speak to each other? The Socratization, and does it correspond to your, I'll say it bluntly, your, in a certain sense, use of the Thomas More Institute in a positive way, that you can use it as a context within which you can pursue your own effort at Socratizing your life, or situating curiosity at the center of your life?
Curiosity is a really nice word to drop in to this article. As you pose the question, because there was, as in our discussion, there was this sense of, well, do we want a gadfly around all the time? So is it just tearing everything down? What about sort of hearing somebody's response and going, well, that's a good idea, let's build on that. And so dropping curiosity into that and framing Socratic questioning is kind of like this pulling on the thread like a child. We go, wait a minute, what's around the next corner? And like just being curious about, well, what if I pull on this? Like what's almost the hidden treasure in this, the hidden little key, to unlock a further door, right? So how can this open up onto something deeper, a deeper vista that I can't yet see, because, where she sort of talked about the untimely questions, she said, I have the answer for closes on the question itself. So if we think about sort of pushing back those, pushing open those doors, right, and reopening those questions in the mode of the curious seeker, then I think it does, bring a joyfulness to the Socratic process.
Thanks.
Joseph mentioned that he talked about page 224, that about the fact is the Socratic method is the way you make progress without knowing in advance how you are going to do so. And I particularly noticed that thing is that I think goes into the sense of curiosity, because in fact what it is that if you read your paper and there is a curiosity there, that in actual fact you're going to make progress, because that curiosity is going to drive you further. And I think that when you're in the class, you're also sharing that curiosity with other people. That's going to further that openness. I think that's when I remember reading it originally. That's the curiosity, that you're opening yourself to so many other experiences. And in this openness, that's where your questions come from. Because in fact, you are trying to see in this openness what response you're going to get and whether that response is going to be the stepping stone to further curiosity. And so I think that I would thank Joseph for that, because he did mention the Socratic method. I had read that and had marked it, but I hadn't thought of that in the way you had mentioned it. So I thank you for that.
Valerie, before we turn to the audience, is there something you'd like to contribute further on that?
Well, I just think that for me, refutation, I personally don't really like that word. And I think refutation for me is curiosity. So when we question each other, it's not to measure to the extent to which someone is correct. It's really about, okay, you have this opinion, the text suggests this, how can we reconcile these things? How can we ask more questions? So I see it as a kind of building off of and moving around rather than refutation. For me, that's what curiosity is for me.
Are there any questions from the audience? Anybody would like to ask Giovanna?
So there was the part where it was saying the conversation, there's like the inner conversation and there's an outer conversation. And this other thing that we have 3 leaders, right? 2 active and 1. Normally, from what I've seen and experienced, is the 3 leaders show up for that meeting before the class, right?
No.
Okay, well then let's put that there. If all 3 show up, when there's a dialogue, and we're hearing Socrates, even the Plato stuff, you're hearing a dialogue, okay, it's not just 2, right? There's some people on the side that are listening to this thing going on. That person says, but wait, last week, didn't so-and-so say this? Or when we were over there getting a glass of wine together, didn't you say this, right? And then that dialogue goes on. And I think that the third wheel, the third person that is not going to be up there leading is the person that sat around the table with the intimate group, right? That conversation. And when they're out there around the table, that's also a moment where they can do that thing of, but wait, when we were earlier talking about this, and I know you guys can't bring this up because you're leading, but can you see, like, I'm just wondering if what we were discussing, could that help us here to understand something? And they end up being the link between 2 people who can't say anything and they could only keep questioning. And so there were times with you that I'd come in and go, oh, I gotta tell them this because you were saying something that was so good, but you can't tell the class, right? So the third person can be the person on the side saying, as would in any dialogue, unless you're 2 people sitting together in the car having a talk. But other than that, there are people around saying, well, wait, I heard in the newspaper, or, oh, last week you said this, and then add to the conversation and allow them access to one of the most wonderful is the leaders have thought about this, they wrote a bunch of notes. And now they're saying, okay, these are the questions we're gonna ask. And the third person gets to go to class, I got the material for you guys.
So I'm imagining, Giovanna, that Heather would regard your statement as further evidence for the superiority.
I just discovered that normally it's not all three that show up for the meeting.
Yeah, most of the time.
Yes, yeah, so I highly recommend it. Really, if that's going to be the link between what was discussed that you guys can't say to the one that's down there saying, you know, when they start seeing it's not moving, you kind of say, but wait, earlier I heard somebody say this, what page was that on? Right? And you can kind of get there because the nuggets of gold I've seen are that three people sitting around talking.
Heather, did you want to say?
Very much.
Valerie, thanks for bringing up the word reputation. But I'm not fond of either.
Reputation or reputation?
Oh, I heard
Reputation.
reputation.
No, reputation.
But imagine that she had said.
Actually, I wanted to talk about outreach. We used to say that Thomas More was the jewel in the crown of English Montreal. And we had a research institute to spread the word. And Charlotte's vision, Irene is nodding because they really did try to go everywhere in America and even travel further abroad. So we have all these wonderful books that, to my mind, every time I look at them, there's something new. I would hope, and I hope you're listening, Marley, that we spread the word because we have an excellent opportunity via Zoom. And I've been in several courses now where we have people from Europe. I mean, Diane Moreau is there. We can bring in all our friends who have moved away and spread the word. And we could do it in the winter session when we are Zooming anyways, because we're just too good to hide under a barrel. It's incumbent upon us to grant and show the advantages and wonderful things that Thomas More does. And I think there is no other organization on earth, and people can research this. I'm getting more and more 80 years of volunteers, 100 volunteers doing this. And once you're in, you're addicted for life. It's radio that does this.
Can I just answer with Heather?
Continually.
Heather, one of the ways that we do it, of course, is by the seniors program.
Absolutely.
Because that is really something special. The fact is that we actually go into the environment that they live. And not only residences, but drop-in centers and different things like that. And I think if there's anything about the method that I find so wonderful, is that the responses that we get, that people come year after year after year. And the reason why they come, they say, this is something so special. And I think that's the fact is that, and that was something that was recognized at one time, is that you just can't stay in one place. You have to go out and spread.
Let's spread the word.
Yeah.
Rena and then Judy. And then Joseph.
I'm wondering what is meant in the text we read by the sentence, war is conversation. It must relate to something that wasn't excerpted for the sequence of pages we were given. How is war conversation?
I think that's coming from Clausewitz.
From Clausewitz, that's politics by other means, but that's not conversation.
But that's the.
No, the diplomacy. The diplomacy is the conversation.
That's the political situation that you're talking about.
It's a sentence in the text.
Do you have
War
a
is
page?
conversation. I'll try and find it, but we just read it.
It's 248.
240.
248.
248.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Here we go. It's the last of the second paragraph on 248. The Socratizing move seeks out the coherent reality behind the incoherent imitation of the reality that shows up in our everyday lives, and it often reveals that what was going on in everyday life was something very different from what it had appeared to be. For example, war is really a form of conversation.
But I don't think they'd agree with it, right?
Sorry, you don't what?
Different from what it agrees that appears to be.
for example, war is so they're objecting to that, right?
If you
That's not
take
how it makes
conversation
sense.
as a way
It's not how it
of
makes sense.
influencing the other with the opinion, then war is another way of influencing the opinion of the other side.
Or Thomas More. Group has gone back to discussing the text.
That's very zen. Yeah. There are a lot of questions, but we're at 8 o'clock right now. Joseph, go ahead.
Okay. I'm glad that I'm the last one. But on the bottom of page 234, but in you, I both have the same question, yet different answers.
Yeah.
A path opens up, Open Socrates. We can test our answers against each other. The process is the Socratic inquiry. The Socratic method is a way you can make progress without knowing in advance how you are going to do so. And I think that's what this institute is all about. There's got questions and questions and questions. Danny used to make me crazy. Another question.
There you go.
I promised Judy that she would have a chance, because I noted her when she raised her
Judy.
hand, so
Sorry.
we can't give Joe the last
No,
question.
no.
Judy.
I was so interested in reading this to explore with the author what it is about Thomas More that is reflected in here that explains why Thomas More it works so well. And the last chapter, I just thought, and I'd like to hear what people say if we have the time, but maybe not. But the last chapter I thought was the most interesting, talking about equality and what the speaker gains. And so I'm looking at my own experience and the experience of others here. And remember, she talks about how a speaker gets confirmed in their thoughts by the listener when there is feedback. And I thought that was so important. You remember the little anecdote about the Heather person and her joy in that she had the opportunity to lead and direct other people's minds. And I thought that was so important for us as participants in the classes, that we get sometimes that affirmation. We see people nodding their heads. We see, okay, I've said something, I'm okay. We're all equals here. And I think that's what Thomas More affords to people.
Me, 1% of the time, that's why you keep coming, and as Danny says, it's tough. It's really, really tough. But you have to listen to your group and rely on your group.
But the choice of love is wonderful.
In the heart, Tony said.
But we should give them a chance to respond. We can't just tell them everything. Let's hear from them.
Learning to listen.
I'll refute you if you refute me. Deal?
You could ask the question in a different way. How does having read this text change how you might approach leading at the Thomas More Institute? Can you guys give me, each we got 5 of you, a quick little thing? Maybe it wouldn't change anything. It just confirms what you've been doing. That's an okay response. Just curious.
One of the points that I think that she makes that sometimes we forget that it is social. And I think that we get so involved with the questions and all this sort of thing that we forget that we are participating all together. And I think that aspect that she pointed out was something very important for me. And we had discussed this before earlier in a meeting. And if that was one of the things that I learned from, there were many things that I learned from this test. But one of them, I realized that that's why Thomas More works, because it is a social thing.
Thank you. That's very important. Last week when we had the reception, I brought one of the leaders from the seniors outreach program from Gore up in the Laurentians. She was a social worker before, and she didn't know anything much about Thomas More or method or what. She's naturally very good. But she explained that when you try to help someone, let's say as a social worker, and it's just you're helping one person. It's very, very different when you put the people with the problem in a group. And when they're in the group, first it takes a while till the group gels, but once the group gels, they really help each other, they really learn from each other. That's a thing, the social component is very important.
Yeah, and if I may respond, I think that also this text talks a lot about the intellectual aspect of conversation, but I think what's come up through a lot of these comments too is the importance of, especially if you are participating in refutation and challenging each other, is the importance of emotional safety in the group. And I think that that's part of being a leader as well. Is it is affirming when people seem to respond well to the questions, but I think it's just the fact that they are responding and sharing their opinions, especially people who may start off quieter at first and then feel more comfortable speaking when they get to know the group more and the leaders. I think that's something that I'm taking from this conversation, is the importance of that, not only being together, having that social dynamic, but really the safety to be able to speak.
There's just one thing that I've, the last year I've noticed, well, last 2 years, is that I'm somebody that doesn't do very well with public, what I perceive as public humiliation. So that's why this school worked for me, is that you can just sort of say, well, I was thinking, and because questions are coming from the front, right? And when I see that what I thought, my answer is just scanned over, that's when I realize, oh, there's a right answer and a wrong answer. And the second I sense that there's a right answer that somebody's looking for, and what I just said wasn't, I stop speaking.
That's such an important point for the leaders as well.
Yeah, if
you get an answer that isn't the answer you were looking for, it's okay to engage with that and not make them feel like they just said something that made them unworthy of speaking ever again. But there's another side to that as well. And it's if they give you the answer you were looking for, and then you shut the conversation and don't allow others to engage. It's important to always remember that there are other people who have a perspective. I think that's something that I've learned over the last few years. If you land on where you think someone agrees with you, there are other people who are in this dialogue and who want to engage. And if you shut down someone because you think their answer is wrong, or you don't allow others to speak because you think the answer is right, you sort of set up a hierarchy already within the conversation, and you lose that.
How do you go when somebody says the right thing, right? And they're all of a sudden, they caught the ball, and now, how do you take it to, like, what's the next step to keep that still alive?
You try to engage the next people, because you should never ever say, yes, that's the answer as a leader.
Well, I think you should say every response ends with a comment.
Exactly, exactly. Every response ends with a comment. And sort of try to keep the conversation.
Ongoing response.
Exactly, exactly.
So
Because it
there's
is a
both
dialogue.
periods from our responses.
Exactly.
So and that's why you legitimize it, whether you agree with it or not.
Exactly.
And then a comment.
A comma.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Because it's a dialogue, not a lecture from you or the participant. So the dialogue is needed.
I hate to be the spoil sport, but I gotta shut this thing down. Before we go across for a little bit of wine and just keep going with the conversation, I'd like to remind you all that on May 26th, we're going to celebrate the close of our 80th anniversary with a cocktail party, a 5 à 7, featuring a talk by art historian Sandra Pekowski on art in Venice, and an unveiling of some of our upcoming courses for 2026-2027. This will be a great opportunity to see Thomas More friends before the summer. So
can you repeat the date again?
Yes, May 26th.
What time?
5 à 7.
No, 5 à 7.
But you can get here at 4.
Okay.
Thomas
More get here.
All right.
I will.
The name is coming. It'll be in your inbox.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. So we could just move across the way. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Valerie. Well done.
Yeah.
Very good.
Maybe a photo of all of you?